very pretty picture. Supported by migrants living abroad. Supported by migrants living abroad because they want so desperately to have a cleaner economy. And he seems to hold out that promise to people. You know, lack of corruption, no drugs, and so on. Okay, so that's the historical irony. I'll stop there. One thing I will say about neoliberalism, just to sort of finish on the paper, is that I believe that it is very present-oriented. It erases the past in a way. If you focus on yourself and your own activities and endeavor as an economic agent, you're not thinking very much about history. You're not thinking very much about the past. That's enough. Thank you very much for your attention.
So many people showed up. I was help out. So I'm sure somebody wants to begin. If you have some question or something. No.
Yes, thank you.
Maybe people can introduce themselves.
Yes, my name is Sigurjón. I'm a professor here in museum studies.
Okay. An anthropologist.
An anthropologist, yes. I was wondering, because you mentioned in the beginning temporalities, and you were dealing with two different contexts, you know, the Philippines and Canada. And I was wondering, is there any, in terms of, the sense of temporalities, in cultural terms, in individual terms, the differences between people in the Philippines and then in Canada in terms of sensing time, being it administrative time or even individual time. Is that an issue, or have you come across that as an issue as a kind of a critical point of those immigrants in Canada from the Philippines? Have they? Is there any kind of difference?
I think there is. I think migrants from the Philippines talk a lot about patience. They talk a lot about faith, and they talk a lot about hope in a way that you don't hear that conversation going on in Canada. But Canada is so complex, so you have to be, which Canadians are we talking about, right? So there are large migrant populations in Canada, or immigrants become migrants, become immigrants, right? So there's big centers like Toronto and Vancouver are coming up to close to 50% of migrants. So it's pretty hard to talk about a mega pan-Canadian sensibility in some ways. Sometimes it's possible. So, I think there's an impatience, if you like, on the Canadian side, and a patience on the other side. An impatience to get your workers in, or to get your relatives in, if you're talking to migrants. Whereas on the other side, in the Philippines, there's just the sense that it'll take time, so you just do everything you can in the time available and hope that you're doing the right thing. So there's this constant changing, snap, snap, snap here, fast, fast, fast here, and while life is very fast in Manila, where everybody has to go to leave, there's also this sense of patience and the long, yeah. Thank you for the question.
I'm Jung Kim from Gangwon National University, Chungcheong, Korea. Thanks for your lecture. First of all, you really reflect us some main topics on international migration. I just like to ask you to add more explanation about historical irony of ESTA 1986, because as far as I know, the Filipino government continue to promote export migrants, actually main national agency or institutions already settled under Marcos government. And systems and those manpower-driven exporting policy seems quite not changing so much.
Right.
Yeah, so I
Right.
wonder, could you,
Right.
what would be this ESTA via some ironical
Right.
historical moment?
So Marcos put in the infrastructure and encouraged labour export partly as a way of quelling social protest. I mean, migration is like a safety valve. If you can let people leave, then they're not going to make as much trouble at home. So when I first started going to the Philippines, there were the landlines, but no cellular connection. So people would line up, and those landlines were put in place during the Marcos era, in part to enable communication, which sort of set the migration process ahead. As I said, people had been leaving throughout the history of the Philippines, seafaring during the U.S. Colonial period, a lot of people going to the U.S. So migration was normalized, but after Marcos, Coria Aquino comes in, and she tried to put moratoriums on Filipinos going to countries where migrants were badly treated. Massive protest. You have to let us leave. We want to leave. It was kind of amazing, really, because it's the first time that there was some control exerted. And then we get to Ramos. People are still going, terrible things are happening to them, they're not, they have to pay taxes, but there's not as much provision for their safety. And after Balabagan and Contemplacion in Singapore, Balabagan in the UAE, migration policy gets firmed up. So to me, the irony, and it continues, tweaking, the CFO is constantly encouraging migrants to do development. That's part of neoliberalism. As a global migrant, you're now a national hero, which Ramos started, and you're responsible as an individual to help develop your community. So you send money back to the Philippines, and there's a lot of encouragement at these CFO overseas Philippine migrant seminars for people to actually take responsibility, sponsor something in the Philippines. And you see this, and the medical professionals go home, medical missions. So to me, it's ironic that something that was part of a corrupt, violent dictatorship has been sustained. The first migration was talked as a stopgap measure. It was temporary. We'll do it because we need to do it to fix things. But it's become now part of not only national policy in its development agendas, economic development agendas, it's also part of people's everyday sense of themselves and their futures and their plans. So to me, that's ironic.
Oh, okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Someone up there?
My name is Katla. I'm a student here at the University in Museum Studies. And I was thinking about this tension you talked about that was sort of being manufactured between the local workers and then the migrant workers. And I was wondering just how this tension was being manufactured, in what ways?
The media picked up on a story. There was one kid who was working for a fast food chain in BC who claimed that a Filipino worker was promoted to the management level and was getting more hours than he was. So the media reported on that story, and then another story was picked up, again in another province. And there's a website that reports complaints, because in order to bring in temporary foreign workers under the old system and the new system, you have to go through a labour market assessment process and prove there are no local workers, right? So I checked the website, and there were no complaints. And then the media reported a couple of these, and then a right-wing think tank produced a report, and it just took off. It just took off. The reason why Aquino was in meeting Harper was partly a diplomatic mission to discuss the treatment of Filipino workers in Canada, because there was this anxiety. A lot of Filipino workers were feeling quite threatened. Now, I don't know that they were actually threatened, but it was a moment of great deep anxiety for them. This whole national conversation about, you know, which Kenny and his associates and his members of his political party were quite willing to engage in the media. But in fact, the media made much more of it than actually was the case in terms of the actual numbers of workers feeling that these workers were displacing them. So that was the fast food sector. Another instance, and this was perhaps more serious, in the BC mining industry, there was a Chinese company that bought a mine, and it imported its Chinese mine workers, and that was a unionized context. So local labor unions complained about this, and the Chinese company said, well, we've got Chinese equipment, we need people who can speak Chinese and so on, which didn't fly. So they got prevented from bringing in their workers. So there was that instance. The Royal Bank was trying to do something with it, deploying its work back. So there were a few moments there, and I was going to say one other thing. At that time, temporary foreign workers were being paid less, which of course made it much more attractive to employers. And, you know, the temporary foreign work program prior to all of this massive expansion in service sector work was mostly agricultural seasonal workers who could never stay. They would come in up to 10 months and have to leave. And that's a steady thing that's been happening for a long time. And they move from country to country because they want more docile workers too. And then it would be the very, very highly skilled, you know, executives and so on. Very small numbers. So for that to go over the 250,000 of permanent migrants was phenomenal, and it happened very quickly. 2008, reform starts. 2009, by 2010, the number surpassed. So it just expanded. Yeah, so more was made of it than was actually the case. And there were corrections made. Oh, suddenly we have to pay them the same, and so on. It continues, by the way. It's just they made it harder for people to bring those workers in. The employers had to pay more. Yeah.
Okay, I don't think we have time for more questions, but thank you very much for participating.